Hello, dear viewers, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Wolfheze again. And as we promised, we're doing some more regular streams now. So today we'll be discussing another topic that we both enjoy very much, which is Archeofuturism. I've made a number of videos about the idea of Archeofuturism in the past, not so much talking about the ideology, just kind of short videos promoting it with sort of artistic imagery. And since one of the next editions of this episode will be about Archeofuturism, we thought it would be a good idea to delve a bit more into Archeofuturism, as Dr. Wolfheze is quite, would you say you're an expert on the subject?
Well, Faust, first of all, thanks again for having me on your show. It's a pleasure. I do agree with you. It's very important that we talk about Archeofuturism because it is one of the few philosophical underpinnings that is relevant for the European New Right, as well as ethno-nationalists. There's, of course, an overlap between the two. I am not a specialist as such because it's a completely new field. The field is perhaps 10 years at best. And to be a specialist in it, you would need to be a philosopher, which I'm not. I have studied the field from a cultural anthropological point of view. And from a traditionalist perspective, it's also interesting because it has some links with thinkers that are relevant to both schools of thought. I am interested in Archeofuturism for my work, as I told you, from a cultural anthropological perspective. And I have actually published a book, or I am publishing a book with Arctos called Rupes Nigra. So translated, it means the black stone, which will give an assessment of Archeofuturism for the European New Right.
Yeah. Now, you could possibly argue Archeofuturism is actually part of the traditionalist philosophical school in a sense, because it tries to combine tradition with modern technology and modern phenomena. I'm a big proponent of Archeofuturism because I have some issues with a lot of traditionalists who turn the idea of traditionalism practically into ludism, where they deliberately reject technology and innovation and they'll just call it all modernity and say it's all bad simply because it is part of the modern world or because it destroyed certain forms of tradition. That's one of the reasons I find Archeofuturism particularly interesting, because I think technology is pretty much inevitable. You can't really do what Ted Kaczynski proposes or the Luddites propose and try to turn back technology. I've got a 45-minute video explaining why on this channel, why I think Ted Kaczynski's perspective. He's got interesting insights, but his solutions don't work. He's kind of like Marx in that sense, I guess. This is why I personally find Archeofuturism a very interesting philosophy, because it is basically about taking what is valuable and truthful from the past and try to combine it with phenomena of the modern world and to solve problems of the modern world with solutions of the past, and to solve problems of the past with solutions of the modern world, I would say.
Well, I think you hit a nail here. The founder of Archeofuturism exactly proposed that if we have a founder, that would be Guillaume Fay, the French philosopher. He called the title of his book Archeofuturism. So in 1997 it was published. It has been translated into several languages now, including English. And that's exactly what he proposed, a synthesis of modernity and European tradition. And modernity understood under its technological and technological idealist point of view. So the fusion that he proposed came from a long analysis that he made of a so-called convergence of crisis. So what Fay noted in his book was that several crises are coinciding in European and Western culture as a whole at the moment, and that to deal with them we need an overarching meta-narrative that does justice to the needs of the modern world, but that allow the European nations to keep their traditional values, to integrate them into their traditional values. So the Luddite perspective, he incorporated that as well. He wrote essays that talked about the possibility of having a section of the population that would live in quite what we would call primitive circumstances, but only a section. So he never proposed a return to nature, such as, for example,
this always reminds me of in Brave New World. Of course, the focus is on the city. But in Brave New World, there's also nature reserves. And in the nature reserves, the people who cannot cope with the modern world, who can't cope with the stresses of modern life, they can go there and live like Stone Age people if they so want. And that was a way to basically have these people out of the system so they don't cause problems and for them to have a happy life regardless. So you could say Brave New World, that was not an Archeofuturist novel, naturally. It was written 50 odd years before this was a term. But it does have a lot of the descriptions and ideas of using technology to solve problems that you could perhaps say have something to do with the Archeofuturist perspective. Of course, we would say it's very dystopian. On the other hand, it does seem to be more the way society is moving.
Well, I do think that the book that you just quoted, Brave New World, is relevant. The protagonist of that book is, of course, the so-called primitive man, whose mother is living in a so-called reserve. And it's true what you say. Huxley, in that book, he described the option that people had to live in a reservation if they wished to do so. That is not something that we see in Fair. Fair is different in his perspective. He thinks that a large section of the population would be relegated to the reservations, to primitive circumstances against their wishes, basically. They would be forced to live in a kind of serf-like circumstances, according to a very hierarchical social structure.
Mm-hmm. Yes. There's, I think for Americans, they would be more familiar with the likes of Mencius Moldbug and self-described NRX. And you could see this as being some sort of American derivative of the Archeofuturist idea, because Mencius Moldbug, for example, leans very heavily on the idea that everything that actually works is a monarchy. A company works like a monarchy. The CEO is the king, and the chief managers are the nobility. And he sort of uses these analogies, but he also proposes that there's a genuine solution to take sort of the tripartite society and to take the old idea of meritocratic hierarchy through genetics. And you could say that that's a form of Archeofuturism. There's also specifically within the NRX idea thinkers who go way more into the genetic and transhumanist phenomenon, which you could also see in Archeofuturism, and then specifically people like Nick Land, who talk a lot about genetic modification of humans, implanting technology into the human brain to develop these sorts of ideas. And you could say that that's maybe part of the school. What's your thoughts on that?
I think what you say is right. The American neo-reactionary movement is also has been investigated by Fair. Guillaume Fair was interested in it. Guillaume Fair was also one of the few people in European New Right, because he was part of that, who was interested in American culture, and American technology-based perspectives on the future, because he considered it the second leg of the equation Archeofuturism. So it is true that that movement that is existing in America has some quite extremist proponents like Land that you mentioned. On the other hand, it has developed. It has been developing quite rapidly the last couple of years. I would like to, in this context, tell our viewers that there is an important thinker that actually fits in the category of Archeofuturist, who is American, Jason Reza Georgiani. He has published a quite famous book, World State of Emergency. He also publishes Arctos, and it exactly is continuation of the work of Guillaume Faye, right? It speaks about the state of emergency, which is exactly what Faye emphasized as the crisis that is facing the Western world, which is a combination of factors that is leading up to what Carl Schmitt would call the Ernstfall, so the time that a decisionist intervention in politics is necessary.
Yeah, I fear that Giorgiani, however, has made himself quite impossible among most of the, well, pretty much everyone, because he is a very disagreeable person, and he has this own very unique perspective on how to how to explain ideas like he calls it. I forget what he calls it, but it's sort of vitalist philosophy he has. But to him, everyone else who doesn't completely agree with him is an enemy. And so, unfortunately, it's quite difficult to work with the man. But he has offered some interesting perspectives in the past. Yes. And it's interesting that these, apart from the Americans, which is we would maybe more call the Neoreaction school, most of the other thinkers are from Europe, and then specifically, of course, France. Some Germans, I think. But perhaps it's we should explain further what Archeofuturism is, if you would like to give a formal definition.
Well, I think that is quite difficult because it is philosophy in the making. It is literally a project that is being formed as we speak. It is a young philosophical project. But what we can do is just go back to the basics, and that is the wording, right? We have the term. The first term is archeo, which is of course arche. Now, in English, that's associated with the word for obsolete, ancient, something that's it's not up to date. It's something that is basically interest, sideline interest that is not relevant to not modern life. But we forget something, namely that the root of that word, arche in Greek, means literally origin. So that's an important thing to note. And it is important to note that beyond that, the Indo-European root, so the root language of Greek, Proto-Indo-European, there the term arche, or its predecessor, arche, has a quite specific meaning. Which is a beginning by command, by order, by a word of command. So it refers to authority. And in this sense, Archeofuturism is an important new movement, because it is not something ancient. It rather refers to origins, to permanent structures that exist in our universe. And it refers to the authority that this primordial order has. So it tries to recapture something basically timeless. And of course, then there is a second term, which is futurism.
Just to interrupt for a moment, you could say this is related to the perennialist concept, such as Guénon uses it, which states that across all cultures and across all civilizations, there are eternal truths. We always condemn murder. We always condemn theft. Almost all civilizations are built around a marriage structure of man and woman. There's always religion. Some authors in this field, for example, Emil Durkheim, who wrote on the universalist principles within religion, on which people like Carl Jung and the American, but not in the field of sociology. This is a concept as well, perennialism, although it's more in the field of philosophical and traditionalist school used. So this basically states that there are universal truths. In the sociology, this is mostly looking at human civilization and at religion and at anthropology. But you can also do this in physics, which is more where my interest into it comes from, because there is such a thing as logic and causality in the universe. There's a reason why things always react the same way. You could say chemistry obeys a perennialist principle because there's conservation of mass and so on. So I see this perennialist principle as being absolutely true and fundamental to understanding any form of philosophy, because there simply are absolute and universal truths, which is one of the things why you cannot work with modern leftism, because modern leftism is completely based around relativism and around subjectivity and personal interpretation. Now to go back to you about futurism.
Well, I just wanted to mention the second term, of course, futurism I would like to say that it can be interpreted in a wider sense. It's not a project per se. It also refers to history. It's not just referring to our future as a civilization. It also refers to artistic and cultural movement that we had in the beginning of the 20th century. It started in Italy with Marinetti. And this movement has some relevance to the philosophy of Archeofuturism as it is developing now.
Yeah. To have there's a good lecture by erstwhile Jonathan Bowden, who unfortunately is no longer with us. He did 2 lectures on 2 artists who one might call futurists. One is Ezra Pound, and the other is an English painter whose name escapes me right now, but I will put it in the description or in the comments. And in that, it's the artist from Vorticism, the British school of futurism. And it's if you want to really understand this movement, these 2 lectures by Bowden are fantastic to give you an introduction to it. Futurism is very vitalistic, and this is why it inspired early 20th century revival movements like Archeofuturism and the Italian fascists and so on, because they try to revive heroism and try to bring sort of a human measure into the future.
Yes, the futurist school is also gives also a link with the traditionalist school. So both the founder of Futurism, Marinetti, and an important traditionalist thinker, Evola, they were part of the movement called Dada, yeah, and they were interested in the art forms and in the particular program points that was developed by Italian Futurism. Now, it is important to say that this Futurism contains an element that is both very conservative and very progressive. So that's the same goes for Archeofuturism. Archeofuturism surpasses any kind of left-right divide. We cannot say that Archeofuturism is a rightist project or a leftist project. Rather, it incorporates all kinds of very original ideas that were developed by political thinkers, by philosophers, and by artists throughout the 20th century, and it fuses them, it synthesizes them.
Yes, I do tend to disagree because it rather depends on how you define left and right. I generally tend to define right and left as the right recognizes hierarchy one way or another, whether it's capitalism, which defines people who live by money, or monarchy, which defines people by ability, or fascism, which defines people by deeds, whereas the left is defined by egalitarianism, whether that's liberalism or communism. Both see human, and very humanist as well, they both see humans as being equal and being defined by their circumstances. You could even say that it's nature versus nurture in essence. The right is nature and the left is nurture. So I do think you could place Archeofuturism on the right because it believes in hierarchy and it believes in absolute truths.
Well, what you said is right. It contains a vitalist element, right? And that is vitalist in a sense, not in a narrow sense of Bergson and the French Élan Vital school. It's really a new concept of vitalism that we are seeing in Archeofuturism. What you see with Giorgiani, and I would say that is an important element that he has contributed to the Archeofuturist school, is the incorporation of Heidegger's concept of the Gestell. Yeah, so the Gestell, it is the system in which we live, the mental system in which we exist, which is being shaped by technology, which is being shaped by language, which is being shaped by cultural categories in motion. And what Giorgiani has done is give philosophical leverage to the Archeofuturist school by operationalizing this Heideggerian concept. So the breakout of the Gestell, it is a very important tool. You see also how Archeofuturist thinkers try to deconstruct language, or reconstruct language rather. The artistic futurists of the 20th century, so like Marinetti, they did that by literary devices, poetic devices. Heidegger, he did that by analyzing words and recombining them and redividing them according to root values. And that is something that Giorgiani has continued to also do. Of course, Guillaume Fay did that in his way as well. He has contributed many original terms and original concepts to the school. But what I'm saying, Giorgiani, in fact, continues this school, this train of thought, this practice, and it is very valuable because the breakout of the Gestell, it is something that the New Right movement really is committed to. The breakout of the neoliberalist Gestell, but also cultural Marxist matrix, is essential.
Yeah, I think what you said earlier is right, that what defines Archeofuturism is its syncretism, its ability to combine things. It's in the name, really, past and future, of course, but it's as you say, it uses some terms from philosophy like Heidegger, but it also uses Marxist terms, like alienation is a big concept within Archeofuturism. In Marxian terms, alienation, he uses it mainly as the alienation of labor. Marxism is, of course, mostly about labor. But the idea is that because the division of labor, you don't see the end product of your work, and therefore you have no concept of the value of your work or how it influences the world. And this removes you from the idea of your influence on the world. And you can see that very much, I think, in modern office work, or this has a major influence on the psychological way people experience the world, because they don't see how their actions have an effect on the world. They live in a sort of theoretical world in their heads, where it's the kind of people who talk about police officers shooting guns out of people's hands, or if someone were to run at them with a spear, they just break the spear with their hands. It's because they've got no real world experience with any of these things. And the same applies to labor.
Well, what you are saying is relevant to the topic I touched upon earlier. That is the quite complicated relationship that Archeofuturism has to the left-right divide. There is a very good analysis given of Archeofuturism by an American philosopher. He is called O'Meara. He has published for Countercurrents also. And he has listed Archeofuturism between the so-called Aurora movements. So Aurora, of course, is a daybreak. And of course, we on the right, on the New Right, would refer to this as the Golden Dawn principle. So the restart of civilization by an almost numinous event. And O'Meara has analyzed Archeofuturism as part of a larger wave. A wave in which he also sees, for example, participating what we see in Latin America happening in the 90s. This is the Mareo Rosa in Spanish. I think in Portuguese it's called Onda Rosa, the pink wave. So it is the pink wave that has engulfed many Latin American countries in the time of Lula and Morales in Bolivia and Chavez in Venezuela. There was some philosophy attached to that. Most people don't know that. And an important element in that movement was the so-called indigenismo, the indigenism, the translated
nativism, you could say.
Yes. If we look at this, then we have a very interesting common ground with white nationalism, because white nationalism, in that perspective, would also be part of that indigenism movement.
Well, they would never accept it.
I know that, but it is an interesting perspective. O'Meara has pointed that out. He has said the rise of white nationalism in its present form, in its intellectually and philosophically formidable form that it has now, occurred simultaneously with the Onda Rosa in Latin America and the rise of indigenism. Well, he has said it is what we see in his view is a global movement, a protest movement, reaction to globalism, to transnationalism, and to nihilism. And of course, for O'Meara, Archeofuturism is the highest intellectual and philosophical expression of that larger wave. That's how it defines it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because we saw in the British nationalist movement about a year ago, a few months ago, they were using quite anti-colonialist rhetoric, which you could also say is something that they borrowed from Marxists, where they were saying, well, people have a right to their own lands, and like indigenous populations have a right to have rights, and trying to apply the UN treaty about something or other. But this was all anti-colonial rhetoric, which 50 years ago could have been from the playbook of a Marxist movement in Angola, for example. So we see this sort of cherry picking. Well, cherry picking is a bit of a negative word, but this freedom of intellectual thought on the modern right. For example, also the concept of hyper reality, which is sort of what I was talking about earlier with office workers and people alienated from labor. They live basically outside of reality and in the narratives the media tells them and so on, and they don't experience the world entirely themselves. This is a Marxist concept from the French Marxist symbologist. I forget his name as well, doesn't really matter, but the fact that we take so many ideas from different schools, like you get Moltbach, who takes feudalist ideas and combines them with libertarian ideas. You get Archeofuturists who take Marxist concepts, anti-colonialist concepts. The modern right is very fluid in its thought, I think. And what it defines it is simply its core set of principles, which would be anti-egalitarianism and hierarchy, and a strong concept of meritocracy, and the idea that there is an unchangeable nature. And I think Archeofuturism kind of can be applied to all of these and is none of these, because it is a set of ideas in and of itself, but it is also sort of a general principle you can apply to things. The idea of just combining the old and the new to make a more workable and truthful model.
Well, I have in my new book, which Nika termed Archeofuturism, an intellectual emergency movement. It is a movement that is addressing a crisis situation. We should not forget that. So, Guillaume Fair pointed to a number of crises. I think there are four of them. There are four main points of crisis. But one of them that has to be addressed is certainly the issue of transhumanism, which fits in very well with what you just said. The alienation principle, right? The idea of alienation that comes from Marx but has been developed in a sociological sense. The distance to reality that is characteristic for modern Western urban society. This is something that has been addressed by Fair and even more strongly by Giorgiani. Giorgiani has spoken of the need for a spectral revolution. So, a revolution that is taking into account new reality forms that have not been experienced in human history before. And of course, this we can say that this alienation process, this living in a virtual reality, is accelerating. We can see that also for the West as a whole at the moment through the COVID laws, right? People are locked in their houses, they are mainly working online. They are being cut off from what we would call the real world, even by legal measures. So it is a process that has been accelerating and in the last year has accelerated even further. So it is a very important part of the crisis that Guillaume Fair already saw coming, and that has to be addressed by Archeofuturism. But there are more points except that. Other 3 points I would briefly mention. They are a social implosion, I call it. So, for example, Fair called that the cancerization of the social body. The second point would be ethnic replacement, something that's important for the European new right, of course. And the last point would be, and that is quite controversial, European new right and American new right. It is ecocide. I call it ecocide. So anthropogenic climate change and the destruction of nature.
Environmentalism has always played a larger factor within the thinking of the European right than in the American right, which the American right continues to have very heavily libertarian ideas simply because that's the origin of their country. They will always fall back on the Constitution as one of their primary fallbacks. And it's interesting that, of course, two of the thinkers that get lobbed into this big pool of ideas and ideologies are Ted Kaczynski and Pentti Linkola, who are both conservationists of an extremely radical sort. And they get quoted a lot, and there's this group that calls themselves Pine Tree Gang, who are Ted Kaczynski adepts. It's an online phenomenon. And again, these do and don't fit with Archeofuturism because, for example, Ted Kaczynski's solutions are simply ludism, and they wouldn't work. Pentti Linkola would be closer to, for example, the idea of the reservation. We create reservations for those who want to live with nature and commune with nature, and we try to limit the technological expansion and to be as environmentally friendly as possible. My sort of concept would be sort of a feudalist society, but with hyper-advanced cities dotted here and there across the world, a place like Singapore or Japan and Taiwan, and then the rest of the majority population can live in a more relaxed lifestyle, essentially. There are some problems with that. Major cities, for example, are known to be IQ shredders. But this would be sort of, in my idea of Archeofuturist as a sort of societal guide, what you could do with it. Now, another thing you say about new ideas is one of the other big thinkers within the Archeofuturist sort of idea is Spengler, of course. That Spengler would say there is nothing new. In a sense, everything that seems new isn't really new. It's just part of the cycle. And if you think it's new, it's because you're looking too much at the details and not enough at the bigger picture.
Well, we go back to what Archeofuturism was designed to do by Guillaume Vert. That is being a toolbox, a think tank project that would help cope with crisis situation, situation of converging crisis, so what Giorgiani called the world state of emergency. And that brings us also back to an old concept of politics that used to be dominant until the beginning of the 20th century, namely the combination of geopolitics, demopolitics, and ecopolitics, right? They used to be one. So politicians that were really concerned for their country and the people who had to make decisions, they overviewed the relation between these three fields. And this is something that the European New Right is trying to redo again for our situation at the moment. So we cannot ignore eco-politics and only focus on demopolitics, and we can also not ignore geopolitics from that. They are all three linked. They are in the final analysis, they are linked. So the decisions that are being made on purely economic basis or purely political basis, they have effects on all three of these fields, and that is something that we have to look at. So a holistic approach, like Linkola proposed, is very relevant, but to activate it, it is perhaps good to go back to the roots of what we would call the deep right, the deep green right, and that those origins are much older. They go back way further, till the 30s, till the 20s, right? I think that
before the Industrial Revolution, there were no authors on this topic because it was simply not perceived as being necessary.
Yes, but it is very important for our movement to reinvestigate thinkers that were very relevant in the mid-20th century. For example, we had Walter Darré. He was promoted to become agricultural minister of the Third Reich to 1942, if I believe correctly. And he was a proponent of what we would call now deep green politics, right? Nature conservation, balanced bio-industry, balanced agriculture, and a very holistic vision of the combination of politics and economy, right?
You could say that one of the best embodiments of this would be the Völkische Bewegung in Germany, of course, with the Wandervogel and so on, who had a very big tie to nature and to politics and to economy and so on. To give an Anglo-Saxon example, the poet William Blake was very strongly anti-industrialism, but again, more in the sort of ludist sense, unfortunately. He wrote the famous phrase "dark and satanic mills" in reference to the industrial cities of Manchester and Leeds and so on. And he's sort of the founder of an intellectual tradition in which you can also place Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and a number of these other more fantasy author sort of writers. And they wanted to return to pastoralism, the country life, the English gentleman in his tweed jacket and living the quiet life in the countryside. But again, more in a ludist sense. They more wanted to abolish the factory rather than incorporate the factory into a new system of thinking, to use it in an environmentally friendly way. It's of course funny that modern environmentalism is very much characterized by this idea of we don't want to reduce our lifestyle, we don't want to reduce consumption really, we just want to consume in a more friendly way. Pentti Linkola and Ted Kaczynski both were very strongly of the opinion that this is impossible and that you have to reduce consumption, you have to reduce lifestyle. And I'm generally inclined to agree. You can't just solve this with solar panels and windmills. The lifestyle is just too much. It can't be sustained, the modern Western lifestyle.
Well, this addresses the question of ethics, right? It is the question of bioethics and ecological ethics. And these are points that are very strongly present in the European New Right tradition. European New Right is very strongly informed by the ideas of what I just, the man Daré, which I just mentioned, his idea of brut und Boden and all the responsibility that people have for the land is important. Also, another thinker that can be mentioned is Savitri Devi. Her last name is Mukherjee. Many people will know her from her Ariel Soviet books and her defense of National Socialism after the Second World War. But we should not forget that she was also an animal rights activist and a thinker on bioethics, an important thinker at that. And so these are streams of thought that are going into the European New Right that should be revisited, because bioethics is also a talking point that is being hijacked by the leftists, by our enemies, by the nihilists who are in power.
Well, conservatism in the name is closer to conservation than the idea. It's we were talking a bit about Marx. Marx and the original Leninists and Stalinists had no regard for nature. They didn't give it thought, or they saw it as resources to be used, to be consumed. This has to do with the fact that they are of course really just a continuation of liberalism, which takes humanity as the center of everything. It's humanism, but it's the right wing, the nationalists, the conservatives who were very strongly in favor of conservation of nature. Christian movements, for example, who saw it as preserving the natural order created by God, but also fascist movements and other nationalist movements had this idea. I personally come from an environmentalist background. It's where I entered into politics was as sort of animal rights, environmentalism, and I still think that is quite an important topic. But yes, as you say, the modern left has taken this topic over completely and is running it into the ground with stupid things like Extinction Rebellion, who propose impossible solutions and are completely unpragmatic and totally ideological.
Yeah, so Guillaume Fay, he emphasized this point of eco-ethics and bioethics. He proposed the rewilding of large parts of the natural habitat of European land. So setting aside, for example, half of all the land to let it revert back to nature. This is something that we find back with neo-reactionaries in the United States. We can mention, for example, Brad Stevens of America. Yeah. He has proposed the same. So this bioethics stream is still present in Archeofuturism as well. But it is marginal. I think more attention should be paid to it, and a lot of political ground is to be gained for the European New Right by decisively appropriating bioethics. I find it a very important topic. I am not specialized in it, but I did speak in my academic time with climate scientists. And I'm not interested in discussions about the pros and cons of the climate change question, but when I speak to these people privately, the kind of statements that came out of their mouths, they made me, well, I would say rather concerned for the future. To say the least. We should not forget one thing. The European peoples have their own biosphere. We are the living result of a specific habitat, a specific eco-niche. And to just destroy it wantonly for the sake of a fistful of dollars is perhaps something that we should think about again.
This is all true. But on the other hand, I think this is all looking a little bit too much at the past. There's also the futurist aspect in Archeofuturism, and I think that ideas like rewilding Europe, that's maybe one solution, but on the other hand, technology, while creating problems, also offers solutions. So, for example, with nuclear energy and renewable energy, we can do a lot against the pollution we do. We can make more biodegradable products that stop the pollution of the oceans. Technology also offers solutions. And I think one of the most important things about the futurist part in Archeofuturism is that it offers us a perspective for the future. It's quite important for a Weltanschauung people to have a perspective of why they are in the world, what they're doing in the world, and what they're striving towards. And in my personal interpretation of Archeofuturism, I think humanity should conquer the stars, for example. The idea that we should try and find the absolute truth and the core of what is at the universe. And all of these things, I think, fit very well with the Archeofuturist tradition. So we shouldn't just look at the past for the solutions, and we shouldn't look at just thinkers on the past, but you should also try to formulate new ideas and especially objectives to strive for, because if you have nothing to strive for, you fall into nihilism and decay.
Well, this ties in very well to the core values of Archeofuturism as I have understood them. And this is the non-utilitarian nature of Archeofuturism. Archeofuturism emphasizes the fact that there is a surplus value in being an ethnicity, in being a culture, and being a civilization. And this is non-utilitarian. It doesn't serve a purpose. It serves rather itself. And this ties in very well to mid-20th century concept, namely German techno-idealism. Most people don't know much about that. George Lee has investigated the subject quite extensively. And he has said that the Third Reich, it was propelled by tendency to do technological innovation for innovation's sake, for investigate technical possibilities for the sake of the possibilities themselves.
Right, but in that sense, why does man try to find out what an atom is? Why does man try to discover the wheel? It can get all the way back to the Greeks. It's in the nature of humanity to try to ask the question why and try to answer it. So we will always be doing things for the sake of knowledge.
Yes. So what is important here is to look at the idealist dimension of Archeofuturism, which also ties in with the artistic movement called Futurism. Futurism was convinced that the experience of flying was not utilitarian. It was an experience that was worth pursuing for its own sake, or the experience of driving a car. It was experience that was not utilitarian for the futurist. It was an experience that was worth having regardless of any economic or pleasure principle. So the taking of risk is an important part of that, and that ties into a lost dimension of European civilization, namely our martial tradition, our military tradition, and our investigative and explorative dimension, which is, of course, since the 70s practically lost, right? The last part that Western civilization did in the field of discovery was space discovery. Now it has, it's just scientific. It's now purely scientific.
this speaks to the idea of the Faustian man, of course.
Yes.
The innate drive to discover, and like I say, I mean, Faust. That's the thing. The whole story of Faust is about the thirst for knowledge, the thirst to know everything, and this is as much about scientific knowledge as discovering far places and new experiences, and there's just the wish to know, experience all, to essentially strive to become God is what I think is at the core of the philosophy, which is why it's a deal with the devil in a way. You're always challenging God, but I've got a few videos about this topic on my channel as well. But I think, yes, the space race was, for example, a culmination of the technological and experiential idea of Archeofuturism. And it signals very much that we are dying off as a civilization, that we haven't pursued that any further. You also see this in things like, I mentioned, someone in the chat pointed out, his name was Jacques Lacan, and there's another French sociologist, also a Marxist, who talks about the phenomenon that we as a civilization don't use new symbols anymore. We still have the stereotype of the Frenchman with a striped shirt and a baguette, and we have the Englishman with his tweed jacket and his ball hood. And we have all these old stereotypes. We still use the Bakelite phone as a symbol for a phone, these sorts of things. Our symbology hasn't been updated in something like almost a century, because all the innovations we develop are not inspirational. They don't grab the imagination. Which is a sign of a dying civilization, because if you die in the mind, you eventually die also in the body.
Yes, the renewal of language, particularly philosophical language, is an important part of this crisis. The lack of innovation is what you said, a sign of decadence. Heidegger, and again George Ani, and in a slight sense also some others, they have been working on this. But what I think is happening, we are standing on the abyss. We're standing in front of a very large gap that is coming up. A transition from printed word, for example, to the digital world has an enormous impact, and is going to make the future of our children, if there is any, radically different than our life experience.
But interestingly, it's also, in a sense, bringing us back, because the audiobook is gradually replacing the written book, because an audiobook, you can do multiple things while listening to an audiobook. It's faster than reading a physical book for most people. And it's in a sense bringing us back to pre-literacy times, where we used to carry on traditions orally, where we used to have bards. And I find this an interesting phenomenon, where audiobooks, we sort of drift back towards our natural instincts, where we prefer to hear someone speak in our ear a tale rather than read it on paper. So it's a way, in a way it's a decline, but it's also sort of a return to tradition, I guess.
An important thing for our movement, if I may call it the European New Right, and that would go for the American New Right as well, is there is a problem that we have. This problem is that we are on the defensive. We are associated with conservative values, with old structures, with the defense of values that are untenable. And I do agree with the criticism that has been given of the right as a whole by thinkers, that the momentum lies with the left. So it is being said that the left refuses to accept reality, which the right does. That's true to a certain extent. But we should not forget that the left is, in fact, being proactive. It is trying to literally change reality. It is doing so. For example, by race mixing, by ethnic replacement, by transhumanist experiments, by transgenderism. It might be doing that in a direction that we don't like. That might be true. But it is proactive. It is, in a sense, pushing its will on Western history.
Yes.
And that is what we as the right can do through Archeofuturism. That is our tool for doing the same thing, but then in the direction that we wish, in the direction that we promote.
I think political ideas kind of work the same way as physics. Well, you have to overcome a lot of inertia, and but once the momentum is going, it becomes harder and harder to stop it. It's the second law of motion of Newton. I think the left had to overcome a lot of inertia in the 20th century, essentially, and now they are moving towards light speed, essentially, and there's going to have to be a huge amount of force necessary to let it go. But at the same time, also, one of the things that thermodynamics never takes into account is friction. So eventually, they'll also come to a dead halt without us even doing anything, simply because they'll wear themselves out. Is that a strategy? Probably not, because they'll destroy everything in their path and there will be nothing left. On the other hand, I tend to agree with Spengler that sometimes things are just dead and need to die, and there needs to be a rebirth. And I'm not sure we can bring back Western civilization such as it was. Maybe it will just go the way of the Roman Empire, and there will be some dark ages and then a rebuilding. It's hard to say.
Well, this negative assessment of our biofuture, let's call it biofuture, as a European nations and as a Western civilization. Yes, this is shared by an important thinker called Edward Dutton. I advise people to look at his website.
He's a bit silly.
But he is quite smart and his books are worth reading. He is somebody who is specialized in evolutionary theory as well as sociology. He has a channel, I think it's called The Jolly Heretic. It's accessible in many alternative media.
I will say that you have to have the stomach for a lot of humor.
Yes, that is true, but what you can do is just use his channel as a first start and then go to his books. His books
I would say
quite scientifically
JF has JF Garepi is also very informative, and he has a more clinical style for people who want.
Yes, but at the same time as being quite negative in his assessment of our present social predicament, Dutton does another thing. He is always pointing to the evolutionary arc. He is always saying that there is an evolutionary process going on as well now. He calls that soft Darwinian selection.
There's always selection. Yes.
There's always selection. That's right. So the glass is either half empty or half full, depending on your perspective, because the decline of the Western nations at the same time gives us a possibility for ethnogenesis, right? Like what you said, after the Roman Empire, new nations were being formed on the territory of the Roman Empire.
Yes, but, well, with some of the core of the people, but also mixed with other people, of course. France isn't entirely Gallic, nor is it even entirely Roman. It's a mix, and with Visigoths, Franks, and so on. So that would be the fear. I will say that selection is always ongoing, and one of the big selection process we see in the this last century is urbanism. It hasn't been that long that more than 50% of the world population has lived in cities, only a few decades. And we will have to see if the majority of the people are able to cope with living in cities. We see increases in alcoholism and crime, depression, sex drive declining. We see a big phenomenon of incels and feminists who both have less and less sex. This is one of the things we see in sociology. The fact that the decline of the marriage has actually caused people to have less sex, which also means less reproduction. And we will have to see what kind of people are affected. We see, for example, that very fundamentally religious people have more children than atheist, secularist, liberals. So that's a selection mechanism. We see more suicides and people succumbing to alcoholism. That's the selection mechanism. But we don't have a macro idea of what kind of people and what sort of traits are being selected for yet. I would suspect that empathy is one we're being selected against. That whatever comes out of these cities in 100 years will be a lot less empathetic and probably less intelligent and have a lower attention span. The low time preference will be selected against.
Well, it is not just a natural process, right? There is an element of exercise of programs and willpower in this equation. It is very important that the new right movement has alternatives to offer for the leftists, woke ideology. So if the left is trying to change the world, according to the Marxist motto, that philosophy is not to describe the world, but it serves to change it, then we should not forget that the knife cuts two ways. We, on the right, can do the same thing. Archeofuturism offers quite an interesting synthesis of ideas. And I would say that lately, I think last year, there have been some assessments from outsiders about Archeofuturism for the first time. I would quote a Peruvian researcher, his name is Lyra. He writes for a magazine called, I think, The Reactionary Conservative. It's an online magazine. And he has given an assessment of Archeofuturism that is quite objective. And he has said it has three objective elements that have objective value. And that the first is the idea that progressivism, modernism, so the whole woke neoliberal cultural Marxist system is over, basically.
It is.
This means, yes, that
it is losing.
Speaking, yes,
it is losing credibility. Yes, it is now ruling only through fear, like late Bolshevism.
Right. This is exactly the reason that we see the censorship in the West. Right. Basically, the leftists and the neoliberals have lost all credibility. They have lost the intellectual debate, the philosophical debate. They have no more grounding. This is what this man said. This is why Archeofuturism. This is Archeofuturism's main attribute. The second factor that he say, which he thinks is important for Archeofuturism, is the fact that the ideologies, the specific ideologies of the woke left and the neoliberals, are totally bankrupt. They're anachronistic. They don't work anymore in any sense. This means that Archeofuturism's criticisms are now allowing it to stand over, higher than the enemy ideologies. It's not anymore a battle between equals. It is now just a question of removing the garbage that was left over, the dead garbage.
Yeah, well, yes. I think at best they're in the position Solzhenitsyn was in the 1970s in the USSR. He may have right on his side, he may have truth on his side, but it doesn't change anything, not for another 40 years anyway.
Well, what you say is of course correct, but we should take a long-term view.
We have that time.
There is an old saying that bad ideas they don't disappear. No, they die, and they die with the people that hold these bad ideas. So the baby boomers have to disappear, and whatever is left after the baby boomers that still keep to this ideology, cling to that ideology, have to disappear. That's of course true what you say. Yes.
To quote Jonathan Bowden again, he said once, ideas never die, and in that sense he was referring to the ideas on the right. But I'm afraid this also applies to ideas on the left. If you look at fundamental ideas of fairness, mercy, equality, humanism, these ideas can be found in many historical movements. The Anabaptists basically started a communist commune in München. Münster in the 16th century during the Protestant Revolution. The Jainists, the Buddhists have aspects of this. We say perennialism, so there are eternal truths. There's also eternally recurring themes within human civilization, eternally recurring ideas. And what we today call communism is just a codification in a certain way of human instincts taken to an extreme. Just as much as, for example, certain forms of National Socialism and Fascism can be called certain human instincts taken to an extreme. To be very blasé, and quote Jordan Peterson, he puts this in the terms of the big 5 traits of psychological personality traits, and he says National Socialism is essentially an extremism of orderliness, order above all. And I think there's some truth to that in the idea that there's just so much of a spectrum within the human mind. And sometimes it veers to one side and sometimes it veers to the other. And the problem is, and this is a YouTuber called Ivan the Heathen made a very convincing video about this. The problem is whenever we finally managed to find a consensus of truth, and we managed to overthrow the old system, within a few generations, intelligent young people will start questioning why these orthodoxies exist, and they will start undermining them again. And this happens every time. The Protestant Revolution, the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, every single time, you could even say the National Conservative Revolution in Germany as well. Every single time, bright young people decide that the orthodoxy and the existing system only exists to maintain power interests. Whether it's from the right or the left, that's always the argument. It's only to maintain interest, and they start sawing at the table legs, as we say in Dutch. And this happens every time, and this fits perfectly well with the Spenglerian idea of cyclical civilization. Human minds and human behavior is also very cyclical. And to me, one of the things in Archeofuturism would be that through transhumanism, we could perhaps break this eternal cycle where we can simply pursue only truth in a logical way. Then again, that comes at a price. It comes at the price of where you were emphasizing the importance of experience and living in the moment and feeling something, and the vitalist idea in futurism. To have absolute truth and logic would require the sacrifice of all emotion. So it's a complex issue that we're not going to solve in an hour-long live stream.
Well, this brings us to the last point of this gentleman called Lyra, who wrote this article about Archeofuturism in this Peruvian magazine. He wrote that the third theme that Archeofuturism got right is the approach of what we would call singularity movement, right? Convergence of catastrophes, as Fek called it, the world state of emergency, as Giorgiani calls it. It boils down to the same thing. A catastrophical combination of situations, the like of which human history has never seen before, right? So there are quantitative differences between the crisis that we face now and any other crisis in the past. So we can see, for example, the demographic growth of the world population is asymptotic, right? At the same
applies to energy consumption since about the 1930s,
yes.
40s.
Yeah. Yes. Also, the experiment of the ethnic replacement.
I do not believe
it's being done is also unprecedented. Yes.
I do not believe that is unprecedented. Actually, replacing populations and resettling them with your own people. The Greeks did this. The Romans did this. The ancient Persians did this. Not on as big a scale, but that is just what it is. It's a question of scale. Replacing populations has always been a way for people in power as a tool of control.
Exactly, we're talking about the scale, right? It is the quantitative scale in which things are taking place right now. And this is something that makes our crisis different than any other. The technological aspect is the second part. It also creates unique new possibilities. As Giorgiani has said, the spectral revolution is something we are looking into, right? It is the revolution of seeing the unseen, right? Ranging from X-rays to infrared to ultraviolet detection. We are now able to see things that no human has ever seen before. And this is also now applying to the philosophical field, right? We have been able to deduct sociological laws that no civilization before has been able to deduct. Linguistic laws we have been discovering. Evolutionary laws we have been discovering. This gives us certain levers over what we would call the Gestel, the Heideggerian Gestel. We have philosophical levers that can control this Gestel if the political will is there, if the elite, new elite or old elite, chooses to do so.
On the one hand, the technological issue is a new challenge that wasn't faced before. On the other hand, I think also not, because I see everything as being a fairly linear path of increasing complexity. And if we are to be replaced by something like AI or a better improved human to gene selection, this is no different than mammals replacing dinosaurs because they were better adapted for certain circumstances. It still all obeys the laws of evolution, essentially. I think, for example, people who think in this field, someone like Elon Musk thinks on this scale. He wants to colonize Mars because he thinks that humanity being restricted to one planet means an asteroid could wipe us out at any moment, or a supervolcano. We could be subject to the fate of the dinosaurs at any moment. And seeing as human history is only a few million years old, and on the scale of the planet that is completely nothing, and real civilization is only some 10,000 years old, I think these challenges are very large part self-imposed. Humanity fighting with themselves, but on a long enough timeline, that isn't the real challenge, I don't think. I think nature remains what we have to overcome.
Well, we are seeing propositions that have been made by archaeofuturist thinkers such as Fay and such as Georgia Lee, being implemented in a certain perverted way by the hostile elite, the hostile globalist elite, right? So if you're talking about genetics programs, so the use of genetic knowledge to affect a new generation, this is in fact something that is going to be and is being applied already now by sections of the elite. The same is true for the idea of the world state, which has been promoted under septentrion, it was called by Fay, is already being applied through transnationalist institutions. Techno-idealism, as it has been proposed by Fay and by Georgia Lee, is also being applied by the hostile elite. So it's not a question of whether or not we like these things. It is a question how we direct them and who is leveraging, who is behind the steering wheel of this moving object, fast-moving object called Western civilization. The question is literally a question of who reigns, who has the power, yes, who can direct the system. And this is what Archeofuturism does. It recognizes the same problems that the left recognizes. It deals with the same issues, but it wants to direct them from another way, in another way. It wants to deal with them in another way.
Yeah. There's this ideology called minoritarianism. This is an idea about how power is structured. And it essentially says that the idea of democracy, the idea of majority rule, has always been an illusion in every system. And it is always powerful interest groups who determine the course of things. Elites always determine the course of things, whether ideological elites, money elites, or power elites, in the sense of military or other sense. And they determine the course of where things go, and the idea that the majority rules is just a stupid illusion. And we do have to live by that idea. So yes, this idea is fundamental to the idea of the march through the institutions. Why would you march through the institutions if the majority actually determines anything? It's the people in the right position that determine things.
Well, the mobilizing power of the elite, it also depends on inspiration. So Futurism has great potential in that respect. Archeofuturism has great potential. The potential to relive and reactivate quite strong archetypes in our European civilization is something that we should think about. The futurists did that in the 20th century through art, which is still with us. The remnants of that art are still being incorporated in modern art. And I think a decisionist approach to this, the reliving, the reactivating ancient values and ancient belief systems is very well possible. The left movement that is our enemy, the leftists, they lack the inspirational. They are rather a negative.
Oh yes,
energy.
they feed on negativity. Yes. But
so
the thing
that brings us back to Futurism. Futurism, it was heroic. It was focused on the collection of discipline, the self-sacrifice, also in the national sense of the word, and pushing the boundaries of daily human existence and letting people be inspired by a collective vision. Well, these are all things that the left completely lacks. It is not able to imitate them in any meaningful sense of the word. They are reduced to bread and circuses. So if the right would be able to refocus on these values, it would be very important. Just a discussion about economics and a discussion about sociological problems is not enough. We already have the science on our side. We have already won the debate. It's now a question of inspiring people to step behind and step up.
Well, I think there's a much more practical concern, which is providing safety and economic security to people, because people who step out of line like us will both know the consequences of what happens then. You will be persecuted and you will suffer from it economically. And so long as there aren't networks to provide stability in that sense, this will always be a challenge. I was going to say that while the left has only purely negative cultural influence, from the right, there isn't that much movement. We are dredging the well of nostalgia mostly here in this discussion because we're looking back. We're looking back to ideas all the time. We talk about the futurists, but what is the current cultural movement? What artistic style? You could talk about the romantics, romantic liberal nationalism. You could talk about the futurists. You could talk about the fascists and whatever, the vitalists. But what is the modern art style that will inspire us? What is the great political idea? Archeofuturism is a vision, a perspective, but it is also very broad. And its intellectuals are not that many. And they don't have a very large public profile like in the past they would have. So I think part of the cultural and civilizational decay in general is that even the people who want to defend the civilization, there aren't that many. The greatest talents of our civilization are working in banking, or working as engineers on improving smartphones. They are not, and this is something the modern civilization has, or the modern elites have done very well, is to make it very profitable for people to be not engaged in politics. And this is very important for why the pragmatic concern of security and economic safety are primal before anything can get done. But at the same time, even disenfranchised artistic types aren't creating a new movement. I don't see it.
I think what makes this problem worse is the individualization and the virtual realization, I would say. So the people living in cocoons, living in personalized bubbles, and this is something that I think is being promoted on purpose by the elite, because it deprives people of the synergy of collective enterprise. So just to put 100 people of our movement together in one room and next on one field, they would defeat 10,000 of our opponents because we have synergy. And this is what is being combated in the most strong way by our elite. Our elites is now making it possible for mass meetings to be held, for congregations to come together in a room. And for organization. I think this is not a coincidence.
Yes, we discussed this previously, but I think that's more to do with COVID-inspired resistance. I do tend to disagree that 100 of our people could defeat anyone. 100 of our people would form 300 different groups and all start infighting each other over ideological differences. This is what I mean with the lack of inspiration. There's no leader to look to. There's no artistic movement to look to. Marxists used to fight each other to the death over their differences, right? And they shot each other when they actually got into power over these ideological differences as well. But they did have a sort of unifying idea, and they had sort of their mythical prophetic figure in Marx, or later Lenin, and maybe Stalin and Mao. But they had these big figures, and they had their sort of Bible. What's our Bible exactly? What is our leading ideology? We've got so many different interpretations and directions within the right. Even social democracy, socialism, communism all have very, very closely grouped together general principles and ideas with very slight differences. Within the right, the perspectives can be very, very different. And I think one of the things Archeofuturism could do is, with the perennialist idea, and same thing with traditionalism, is to just say, look, this is the core issues we need to talk about. These, meritocracy, hierarchy, the inevitability of inequality, an objectivist perspective on nature. That's the core. and that's what we all need to stand for. And whether you want a Führer, a king, an emperor, a pope, that's of later concern. At this time, we, I think, need to distill things down to their basics and get people to at least agree on that, and stop fighting over whether you're a monarchist and what kind of monarchist, and should you be a Catholic monarchist or a Protestant monarchist, and so on and so on.
Well, I do think all these competing views and these streams of thought that are conflicting very often, they are building up to a critical mass. And this is exactly what Archeofuturism is tasked to do. Archeofuturism is building up philosophical and intellectual critical mass. And at the right moment, this means when practical circumstances become unbearable, this critical mass will give momentum to whatever leadership is at that moment available and will be thrown up at that moment. We are simply not yet at that point. The build-up of critical mass is proceeding, and the breaking point of our civilization, of our peoples, has apparently not been reached yet. This is the conclusion we have to come to. At the moment it is going to be reached, this critical mass of ideas, the philosophical and intellectual baggage that we have been contributing, which we are contributing in various forms, this will be vital. This will be vitally important. We should not forget there are many great revolutions that have happened in human history, and they always have been of a synthetic nature. So this process that we are in, this archaeofuturist movement that we are in, has a task to build up critical mass. This is the most important task that we have. At the moment that the breaking point is reached, this will crystallize out. This is what I think.
I think that we don't need to worry so much about that, because the left is already creating such dissatisfactory circumstances, economical, social, cultural. They're destroying so much that even without us taking any action, more and more people are becoming dissatisfied with the system. Our role for the moment should be to create those people who could take those leadership positions, to create that intellectual vanguardism, to again borrow from Marxist ideas, in this case Leninism, to create an intellectual vanguard who can take those leadership positions if there ever a time comes. Now, I do believe that it could take decades to another century before the whole system collapses. Civilizational collapse can be over within days, and it can take centuries. It's impossible to predict how it exactly will go down. You can look at general trends, but on the whole, I think these things are outside of our hands. We don't have to do very much to red pill people, so to speak, because society in general, by depriving them of economic prosperity, by denying them the possibility of saying what they want to say, to have freedom of thought and freedom of speech, to have a normal marriage, to have a family, to fulfill their innate biological desires, and that will radicalize them. That's already what you're seeing. The COVID restrictions have been a huge radicalization for many people, as was the refugee crisis in 2015. But what we see every time is that it's ebb and flow. At the peak of the crisis, there will be a lot of momentum, and then it will ebb away again. And some will stay on the beach. And then every time the tide comes in, more people are left on the beach, so to speak, till eventually it's enough to break. But it can take many, many cycles.
Well, I do think there is some positive perspective here, because we can see that our elite is choosing, a globalist elite, is choosing for a Flucht nach vorne. Yeah, so in German, translated, that means a flight forwards. They are going to totalitarian measures. They're applying totalitarian measures to our societies. They are accelerating mass migration, now through the Marrakesh Compact. And they are basically curtailing all the traditional outlets of political scheme outlets that we used to have, right? So these are very positive signs, because what it means is that they know they have lost any possibility of standing their ground intellectually, philosophically, and politically. They are basically bankrupt.
But it also makes it a race against the clock. because they will bring in enough migrants to replace us. And if we are a minority, no matter if you're in the right or not, if you don't have the physical power to overcome it, then it's over.
Well, the catastrophe that is already happening. In fact, we are already living through a catastrophe. It is just slow motion still. This applies on many fields. It applies, what you said, to social implosion, the inability of young people to buy a house and to found a family. It applies to the ethnic replacement program, which is accelerated beyond any president. But it also applies to larger factors, such as the transhumanist agenda, which is now being sped up through technology developed for the COVID program. We should not forget about that. And the same applies, and I would like to remind again our listeners about this point, environmentalism. We're facing an environmental collapse. And this is something that the new right is consistently paying too little attention to, I think. Well, it might be much more urgent than we think.
Absolutely. It's an then again, most of our movement is far too captivated by the news cycle, by the cycle of politics. They don't discuss ideas. They just discuss events and what's happening with whatever Biden did this week or whatever person was shot this week in the United States. That is all irrelevant. That is all wasted intellectual energy. Focus on building your own things and your own thoughts. Now, I want to quickly answer one thing in the chat, which I think is important. The notion of a white strike to refuse to participate in the system, a withdrawal to separate non-conformist from the community. I completely disagree. That will just make you more replaceable. What do they do with low-skilled workers? They import new ones. If you are going to go on welfare and not participate in society, they will just replace you with Indians and other migrants. What you should try to do is to make yourself as irreplaceable as possible. If they can't run a society without Europeans at the top, then they may have to reconsider. If Europeans are all at the bottom of society living on welfare, we are completely replaceable. So you should not try and go on strike, particularly because this is basically a reformulation of the old syndicalist idea of the general strike, this utopian idea that one day all the laborers will go on strike and the system will collapse and the unions will take over. And this is the same idea just for white people. It doesn't work. It's a utopian idea. You should try and make yourself as capable and skillful a person as possible and as irreplaceable as possible. Become an engineer, become a high-ranking manager, become a high-ranking soldier, something like that. Don't become a parasite.
I think this comment shows very well the dilemma that many young people face. It is whether to resist the system or to work within it or to fall out of it. These are choices like a Aussteiger. This is something that we should address. It is an important issue. I do think that we are facing, as Western nations, including in Europe, nearing breaking point. It is, Dutch we say, op of eronder. Either we win or we die. This point is being approached. We should not forget that the processes sociologically which we are seeing in the West are very serious. We are suffering the same kind of problems as Western nations, as white nations, that many indigenous people have been facing and are facing. We are comparable in sociological problems with, for example, Australian Aboriginals, which are not reproducing, which are alcoholic, which are medicated, which are marginalized, which are losing their cultures, their religions, their languages even. This is a process that is going very fast, and we should not underestimate it. It is not time to sit back and wait for miracles to happen. People have to decisively look at their future and make decisions based on a realistic assessment.
Oh, you're cutting out there. You cut out that realistic.
I was saying that it is important for young people to be realistic about their situation. We are facing, as Western nations, as white nations, a situation very similar to Aboriginals in
Yes,
Australia.
That part did come through. Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I agree. You see exactly the same phenomenon. No cultural creation, addiction, high suicide rates, high divorce rates.
Yes, rape is one of them as well. So the illegitimate children, they are all sociological indicators of ethnocide and genocide.
Yeah.
We should not forget about these things. Young people cannot afford to sit back and say, okay, we are going on a strike. We are going to. There is no sitting out. There is no strike. This is a question of surviving.
You're cutting out a lot there again. I'll just answer this question real quick from the chat. This is on the same topic. What you're advocating over there then is not a strike, but parallelism. You're not retreating entirely from the system. You're building your own institutions as far as possible within the system. That's not quite the same thing. I think, unless you have something you really want to add there, I think we're good on this topic. Would you agree?
Yes, maybe just to emphasize once again, we are facing here an existential crisis. In my opinion, the Western nations and the white nations.
Oh, yes, well, your connection is really bad. Hello?
Yes, hello, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, you're breaking up quite a lot, so you missed that entirely.
Well, I was saying that it's important for Western people, young people, to understand that we are facing an existential crisis. And my recommendation would be to try to gain back levers of control over our whole civilization and all our nations. We cannot afford to abandon even the slightest bit of it. We cannot afford a foothold on our own continent of aliens that are being controlled by a globalist elite that is hell-bent on replacing and destroying us.
Yes. Well, on that note, get to work, everybody. Thank you for coming on, and I think we covered pretty much everything we wanted to cover there, so end it there, I think.
Yes, thank you.
All right.